Our last set of notes. Tomorrow we will look at, we'll have an assignment in class where we'll do the rap battle from Hamilton to kind of go over Hamilton and Jefferson's issues with Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. So we'll talk about that. I would like to make sure that we get through that part today so that it makes sense tomorrow. Those of you that have never listened to Hamilton before, it is a play based on the life of Alexander Hamilton and has some really good historical information, which is why we'll use it. So we'll listen to that tomorrow towards the end of class. So, Federalist era, 1781 to 1801. Federalists will become what George Washington will fear is political parties. When George Washington leaves office, he has, and as we'll look in this set of notes, he sets many precedents. And a precedent means you're doing something for the first time and you kind of set a standard. That's a nice, I think, word that means that as a precedent. And he sets many. One being 2 terms. There's nothing in the Constitution until we get to the 1940s that determines how many times a president can become president or be elected president. And George Washington sets that at 2 terms. And we won't have any president until we get to Roosevelt go past that 2 terms. He gets elected 4, which the Constitution then is amended to say, no, we don't want anybody to be president that long anymore. We had lots of presidents that would have really liked to have served more than 2 terms, but that George Washington thing hanging over saying, you know, this is the guy that set the bar. We can't do that. He also sets a precedent in giving a farewell address, meaning I'm going to sum up my years in office. And we don't talk about anyone else's, and this is, again, why it's important. We don't talk about anyone else's farewell address except Washington and President Eisenhower, which there's a whole lot of presidents in between, a whole lot of presidents that made farewell addresses. So why those 2 are important is Washington's does 2 things. He warns about political parties. How much nicer would America be if we would have listened to George Washington's idea about political parties and that they're bad things and they're not good for America. And then the second one was entangling alliances, stay out of alliances with other countries. Just as a spoiler alert, fast forwarding to President Eisenhower, what President Eisenhower, as General Eisenhower, who was Supreme Allied Commander of all forces during World War II, he warns us about the military complex. And when someone whose whole life has been the military complex puts out a warning like, ding, 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 you guys better look out for this military complex thing. It's about to get big. And we move into this thing called the Cold War. So that's one of the reasons why we pay attention to those 2. They really warned us about things that we probably should have taken heed with. So the first thing that George Washington has to set up, that again is not in the Constitution, is some kind of cabinet. And that will be one of the things that we look at. That's what your 1-pager about. That's again one of his long-lasting precedents. There's nothing in the Constitution that sets up what a president's government should look like. And again, wisely chosen George Washington, understanding that I know a whole lot about running a military, but I don't know a whole lot about running a country. And so I probably need to get people to help me. And George Washington, like very few other presidents, chose the best people for the job, even though they don't all get along and even though they weren't all of the same political party. The only other few times we have that in the office of the presidency will be Abraham Lincoln, who chose quite possibly the most awesome cabinet assembled in the history of the United States, besides George Washington. But most presidents don't do that. Most presidents choose people that think like them or that will say yes to them. And sometimes that doesn't always serve the best interests of our country. George Washington knows that. I can't do this by myself. I got to have some people. So starting on the first page of that Federalist era, we're going to look at some things that are happening in the United States. So 1790, we have 4 million population by the 1790 census, and we'll talk about what that census is. And it doubles. It's been doubling about every 25 years. 90% of all Americans live on farms. This is, again, part of what Thomas Jefferson believes our country should be, this strong agrarian country that everyone owns land, everyone's attached, everyone is part of this agricultural experiment. We don't have very many big towns. Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Charleston, and Baltimore. Those are our only really big towns. 5% lived east of the Allegheny Mountains. We have a couple of new states, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. Finances are where we're in big, deep trouble, really big trouble. Public debt was enormous. People owe a lot of money, and that is never good for your country when people owe a lot of money. It always means that disaster is waiting and looming overhead. Revenue has significantly declined. We have worthless paper money. It's worth nothing. We don't have a monetary system that covers all 13 states. We have Virginia banknotes, we have Georgia banknotes, we have Massachusetts banknotes, but we don't have anything in currency that covers all of our new country. Everyone's heavily in debt, and foreign challenges by Britain and Spain. Please, 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 again, do not have the misconception that we win the war and Britain just goes back home and forgets that we're here. We have another war coming up, the War of 1812, in a very few short years, because Britain does not leave. Spain does not leave. They are all waiting for us to fail and to swoop back in. President Washington's administration. He is unanimously elected president by the Electoral College. That will never, ever, 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 ever happen again. Ever happen again. Where someone is unanimously elected by the Electoral College. It shows quite a few things. It shows faith in George Washington. It shows the strength in the idea of a president of the United States, and it shows the power of the Electoral College. Many believe Congress was willing to give the presidency power due to Washington's respectability. They attached that this respectable man who most all Americans knew who he was, understood what he did, and this was one of the reasons that the Constitution had validity. Took oath of office in the temporary capital of New York City. So our capital is New York City. Our first vice president is John Adams. So he sets the first president with his cabinet. And in his cabinet, he says, I got to have people to help me make decisions. I can't do this by myself. And this probably most assuredly comes from his time in the military, where as a military officer, you are ultimately in charge of your command, but you certainly have people helping you with your command. It's the way the Army is set up, that you have units and squad leaders and battalion leaders and commanders that all report up this chain of command, because at the top you can't possibly know everything. And so he says, I gotta have help. And he picks three important areas that he knows that he's going to need help with. He's going to need help with the Treasury. I need help with money. I know I'm going to need help in dealing with other countries. That's not something I'm good at. And I need to make sure that our borders are secure and safe. So I need a Secretary of the Treasurer, a Secretary of State, and a Secretary of War. And we call it the Secretary of War until we get to the 20th century, and then we'll flip it to Secretary of Defense. But it's the same thing. So at the bottom, we have these three cabinet offices: Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson; Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton; and Secretary of War, Henry Knox. And those, again, are very important people. You need to know who those are. I never know if you guys look at my stickers, but on the back of my stickers, I have Knox Moving Company with the two. That's Secretary of War Henry Knox. He essentially saves the Revolution by moving those cannon and getting them out of the way and getting them into New York City. I also have a T-shirt, I think, that says, I don't know if I've worn that T-shirt that says Knox Moving Company, but he is essential. He is the most anti-war looking person you've ever seen. But he never served in the military. He got his knowledge from books. He was owner of a bookstore and just read passively or passionately about war and strategy. And he looks like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Not anything looks like somebody's grandpa. Yeah, doesn't look like a war leader at all. But he is incredibly knowledgeable and helpful. So he also appoints the first Attorney General, Edmund Randolph, who's not going to be that important as the first one. We're going to move to someone else that becomes a little more important, the Attorney General. And this cabinet, again, is characterized by the feud between Hamilton and Jefferson. So if you're looking to put forward a cabinet that would work together, you would not have picked Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. They do not get along. They have complete opposite viewpoints of just about everything, from government to people. They are complete opposites. And again, that is part of the living embodiment of what George Washington assumed this government would be, that it would be something that worked in the best interest of the people. And sometimes people working in the best interest of the people don't always think alike. So on the top of page 2, one of our first things that we got to get is this Bill of Rights. Those of you still working on your PSA, again, this is an important part of this PSA, this fight to include the Bill of Rights. In fact, many states will not ratify without saying the first order of business then will be to ratify this Bill of Rights. And if we look at the Bill of Rights, Anti-Federalists criticize the Constitution for not having one. The amendments could be achieved in one of two ways: a new constitutional convention requested by 2/3 of the state, which has never ever happened, or 2/3 of a vote by both houses and ratification by 3/4. And we have 27 amendments to the Constitution currently. A lot of those amendments are, unfortunately, about raising the pay of senators and congressmen, which you can imagine those go through there pretty darn quick. We have one amendment to amend an amendment. That would be prohibition, and then the amendment to overhaul prohibition. But and one importantly impacts you guys, changing the voting age from 21 to 18, and our 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, abolishing slavery, establishing citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which is increasingly important, is the due process, that everyone has due process under the law. So if we look at these Bill of Rights, and again, because this is not a government class, you're never specifically asked anything about these Bill of Rights, so there's no reason to commit all of them to memory, but I do give them to you. The right to bear arms, or the first one is religion, assembly, press, petition, and speech. The right to bear arms to form a militia. Troops may not be arbitrarily quartered on people. Unreasonable searches and seizures. Individual guaranteed certain rights when on trial: life, liberty, and property. Right to a fair and speedy trial, right to a trial in civil cases, excessive fines, and unusual punishment. Again, notice how many are assigned to that idea of what happens to you legally. This all is as a result of those admiralty courts that didn't grant you a jury, that did not allow you to a quick and speedy trial, that held you in prison. There are places in the world, such as Mexico, for all of you that go on vacation in Mexico, they can arrest you and put you in prison, and they don't have to tell you why. You can just sit there for a really, really, really long time without ever knowing why you're in prison. And they don't have to tell you. It's part of their legal system. You have, in the state of Indiana, 72 hours. They can arrest you 72 hours. They either have to charge you with the crime or release you. Every state is different within that, but 72 hours is about the longest they can hold you, which is why for those people that have been victim of crimes, it appears that the wheels of justice move so slowly, but the wheels of justice are to protect people against these types of things. So before you are charged and arrested, they have to make sure, law enforcement has to make absolute sure, because they don't get you don't get a second chance. You can't be tried twice for the first for a crime. So it has to be done importantly. Excessive fines and unusual punishment is one of the things that was used in the 70s to overthrow capital punishment. It's the reason why, and I know most of you now, although Charles Manson is now dead, why Charles Manson did not die for he was on death row but didn't die. And then 9 and 10, the people retain rights not enumerated in the Constitution. That means we have rights that are not expressly written in the Constitution. It's kind of the flip-flop of the elastic clause, right? The elastic clause says we can't think of everything that government might need to run itself, but we're holding off on saying that if something comes up and it's necessary and proper, we get to do it. And on the flip side, the Bill of Rights says you can't possibly write every one of our rights in this thing. So we also have rights that are not enumerated in the Constitution. And powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states and the people, which is why, and I would write this out to the side, education is a state by state, right? Education is a state-run entity. It is why when people move from places to places, especially people like me with my dad in the military, every time we moved, I had to do something different. It's why I took driver's ed. Back in the day, driver's ed was a class in school. It's why I took driver's ed as a senior with a whole bunch of freshman people, because all of the requirements were so different. So kids that move from Illinois, like I have quite a few juniors this year in my world history class, because they take U.S. history their sophomore year. So every place is different. So the bottom of page 2 is another really important part. The Judiciary Act of 1789. The shortest part of the Constitution is Article 3 that describes the judiciary. It is really short. It's a paragraph. I actually had a professor that had the whole thing memorized because it's so short. It does not define any requirements to be a Supreme Court justice. You do not have to go to law school. You don't have to have ever been a lawyer. You get the term for life. The only thing that can remove you is a crime of high crimes or misdemeanors. It is a really short description. And so we felt, or the early government felt, there needed to be some organization. And so organize a Supreme Court with a Chief Justice, and that will be John Jay. You do need to know the first Supreme Court Justice is John Jay. Organized federal and civil courts and established the Office of Attorney General. And those district courts, the United States is divided up into federal district courts from which the appeal process starts. The fatal provision law stated Supreme Court could force president, and we'll get to Marbury versus Madison. So our first discussion is for the Secretary of Treasury, how to get the United States on its feet financially. That's the first order of business. You should know as we move into like January or February, when the United States emerges onto the world, it is as an economic superpower, not a military superpower. It's an economic superpower, and it begins with these things that Hamilton sets in place. And it takes a really long time for this economic superpower thing to come across. But initially, all things are driven by the idea of having a strong economic foundation. So he does, again, what all of these founding fathers do is they generate pamphlets, reports, and write them down. And Alexander Hamilton looks at two very specific things that he knows that are at the heart of a strong financial system: public credit or public debt and manufacturing. How do you make money? And the report on public debt was a plan to shape fiscal policies of the administration to favor wealthier groups. This is the problem that Thomas Jefferson has with Alexander Hamilton. In return, the wealthy would lend the government monetary and moral support. So what do you got to do? You got to make these rich people happy. If you make these rich people happy, they'll be loyal. Prosperity would, and please, one, see underline, draw a line to this word, trickle down to the masses. This economic theory is going to be like a hamster on a wheel. It's going to repeat, repeat, repeat. And it's a very simple thought process that historically never, ever, ever, let me add 10 more evers to that, works. It never works. Everybody get that? Trickle-down theory never works. Here's why it never works. And I want you to think about this as the person that it benefits. Trickle-down theory is a very simple theory that if government makes it beneficial and somehow eases either tax burdens or any other financial obligations on the wealthy who create business, they will trickle down their profits to the little people. How many people actually think that works? It doesn't. If you give tax breaks, if you give aid to people that have money, that they will be willing to share that money as they trickle down. It does not work. It just doesn't. Rich people get rich by keeping their money in their pockets. That's how they get rich. And so it never happens. Case in point, Sullivan County, definitely not on the up-and-coming rich places of people or places to be, but we're always trying to attack business. And one of the ways governments attract businesses are what's called tax abatements. Has anybody ever heard that word before? A tax abatement. So what the city of Sullivan or the county of Sullivan does is they throw out all these things that, hey, if you move your business here for 10 years, you won't have to pay property taxes. You won't have to pay property taxes. Brampton Brick across from North Central, not paying property taxes. Not. So you think about, you guys don't know how much property taxes are, but you think about that building, that giant industrial complex, they pay 0, 0, 0 property taxes. Why? So they get businesses here so they can hire people. Brampton Brick told Sullivan County how much people they were going to hire, how many people I think they have at the current 10 employees. The solar place over here said the same thing. We're going to hire all these people. We're going to hire union workers. They never did. So for 10 years, they paid no taxes. City Council currently is trying to revoke that abatement because they didn't follow through. The solar place says, go ahead and redo it and we'll just close out our business and go someplace else. That's why trickle down doesn't work. It never, ever works. It never works. We retry it all the time. Reagan will try it again in his 80s and we will have a financial catastrophe after his presidency is over because it doesn't work. How do you get rich? By keeping money in your pocket, not by giving money away. That's not the way it works. So Hamilton is trying this trickle down. Became the basis for assumption of state debts and funding at the par, and we'll get that in a second. And then the second part is report on manufacturers. And when you see that word manufacturers, you just need to think in business. We need to make something, right? We need to make something. So advocated the promotion of a factory system in the United States. This is one of his most important things. We have to have industry. We have to have a way for people to do two things. One, jobs, and two, for people to buy stuff. So the nation could exploit its natural resources and strengthen capitalism. And he begins this idea of a tariff, which again doesn't ever, ever, ever work. So Hamilton's plan, 5 components. The first one is funding at par. So those of you that know golf know that par means even. So think of that as even. If you don't know golf, that's what par means. So it means funding at even. If you want to take that par away, funding at par. This is based on bolstering national debt. That government wouldn't borrow money without investor confidence. If you don't have confidence, then people won't invest in you. And we need to build the confidence in the Treasury system of the United States of America. So urge Congress to pay off entire national debt by funding at par all government bonds incurred by states during the Revolutionary War. So we'll take a pause and make sure we all understand what bonds are, what government bonds are. Does anyone's grandparents, great-grandparents buy you United States bonds for Christmas, birthdays? Okay, good for your grandparents, because those are good, sound investments. All right, so when you get those bonds, they have a face value. They're really pretty. Are they still really pretty? Really pretty to look at? There's bonds or certificates. And what I'm just going to use your grandma. Chloe's grandma has done is she has given the federal government $50. She's bought this bond. It's worth $50. She pays the government and she gives it to Chloe. Chloe then has two options. Actually, she really only has one, but I'm going to pretend you have two. She can go and cash that bond immediately because she wants to buy something, or she can save it X number of years, and at the end of X number of years, she can get $50. But if she continues to save it past that term, and most of them are 20 years, you have to save them for 20 years. After 20 years you save it, then you actually start to earn more. So year 21, it would be, and I'm just saying these numbers, year 21, it would be worth $51. Year 22, it would be worth $52, $53. And the longer you hold them past the maturity, the higher the value. But if she goes to the bank and cashes it today, it probably would be worth, that $50 bond would probably be worth maybe $20. $20. Because you haven't waited for it to mature. That's what the government does. They want you to give them money that they can use and sit on it. And then at the end of 20 years, she can go and get her $50. That's how that works. The states bought bonds from the government because, again, they are secure. And now the states want their return of their money. Government doesn't have all that money. But Alexander Hamilton says we should go in debt to pay that money back so that we restore confidence, that the states understand that the federal government and their economy is sound. So the debts would be paid at face value plus any of the accumulated interest. We owe that to the states, we owe that to the people, and we should follow through with that, which is awesome. If you look, government bonds had depreciated to 10 or 15 cents on the dollar since the new Treasury was believed incapable of paying the obligations. So we're going to pause again. So for those of you that have seen Hamilton and you've not really read anything else about Hamilton and you don't understand why there would be anybody that doesn't like Alexander Hamilton, here comes the why people don't like Alexander Hamilton. So the government's going to do this. Alexander Hamilton, and you can see the government bonds had depreciated to 10 cents on the dollar. So for every dollar, it's worth 10 cents. Hamilton, before he puts this out in play, tells all of his rich friends, hey, guess what's getting ready to happen? The government is going to buy all those bonds back at face value. I'm the rich person. You guys are the minions. I'm like, all that is awesome. Snip, snap, snippity, snap. All you people have bonds that today are worth 10 cents on a dollar. I go to you and say, look, I feel really bad that you guys have lost all your money. Right now, those bonds are only worth 10 cents for the dollar. I will buy them back for you at 40 cents on the dollar. 40 cents. You're going to make 3 times what you would make if you sold them back to the government, if you want to sell them back to me now. Why are you doing this, Mrs. Norris? Because I feel really bad and I know you need help and I have the money. That should have sent alarm bells ringing, jinging, janging through their heads. But no, they sold them all. So now I get all of your bonds and then I just wait. And then now they're worth full price. That's why people sometimes have a negative view of Alexander Hamilton. Because he takes care of these wealthy people. Why? Because Alexander Hamilton so badly wants to be part of that group. He's never part of that group. He wants to be part of that group. So he sells out the American people by telling all these people, like, hey, if you just wait a couple days, my rich friends, you're going to get richer. Speculator still had large amounts. Wealthy investors rushed to buy as many as possible before Hamilton's news reaches them all. Original bondholders, that would be common people who supported the revolution with all their dimes and nickels and pennies they could find, were now gypped out of actually getting all their money back, plus interest. Hamilton bitterly criticized, especially by Thomas Jefferson. All right, assumption of state debts. This is the next one. So funding at par, assumption of state debts. Hamilton urged Congress to assume the state's debts. Again, Hamilton's ulterior motive is to obligate states to the federal government. Hamilton wants a strong central government. That's his purpose. Hamilton believed national debt was a blessing that could cement the Union. States with large debts, of course, favored it, especially Massachusetts, New York. Southern states, not going to want to do this. Southern states say, absolutely not. We're not going along with this. State of North Carolina, state of Georgia, state of South Carolina, they had, bless you, they had hardly any fighting. They don't have a lot of debt, paid it all back. So South, North struggle ensued over this assumption of state debts. So we have a compromise achieved through a process called log rolling. And again, this isn't a government class, but just so that you understand. Log rolling occurs when two opposing factions agree to vote for each other's bills so that their own cherished bills will pass. So in essence, how am I going to get the South to vote for this bill? I got to give them another bill. And so this other bill would be where the new capital of the United States is going to be located. So if you've ever wondered why the capital is in the South, that is why. Because the South says, give us something that we can vote for, and we'll vote for your assumption of state debts. Hamilton says, all right, you can have your state capital or our federal capital in Washington, D.C. Just so, again, that we're fair to all of our founding fathers, guess who owned all of that land? This guy named George Washington. So the federal government had to buy a whole bunch of land from George Washington. Again, a little bit playing it loosey-goosey here because lots of people are making lots of money. So that is how our capital became located in Washington, D.C. D.C. stands for the District of Columbia. And if you've never been to George Washington's home, how many of you have ever been to Mount Vernon? It is absolutely astoundingly beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful. And I can see precisely why he built his house. It overlooks the Potomac. It is stunningly beautiful. If you ever have an opportunity to go to Mount Vernon, I highly encourage it. It is beautiful. So South would get the new federal district. So the South says, all right, we'll vote for this assumption of debts if you give us a capital in the South. The next one is tariffs, and they become a source of revenue for paying debt. A tariff is a tax. And a tariff is a tax placed on goods coming into the United States. The premise is to ensure that people buy goods and products in the United States because their prices will be low. Tariff revenues depend on a healthy foreign trade. The Revenue Act of 1789 imposed an 8% tariff on durable goods. First tariff passed in U.S. history at the national level. Secondary goal was to protect infant industries. Here's why tariffs don't work. They work perfectly fine if you are someone that is not exporting goods. But as soon as the United States placed an 8% tariff on all goods coming into the United States, what do you think France and England did to all the goods coming into France and England? They placed a tariff. Tariff wars don't ever work. At the end and the bottom line, the people that are always hurt are the people that buy the goods, because those goods are either highly taxed, or especially those people that export goods. Those are usually the ones that are hurt financially the most because their prices go up. Next one is excise tax. In 1791, Congress passed an excise tax on whiskey. So an excise tax is pretty much the same thing as what the colonial or the crown did to the colonists in a Stamp Act. It's just taxing certain things. And an excise tax means not everyone has to pay it. So it's just people using whiskey. Excise taxes currently are like on wheels. We have a wheel tax. So if you look at your registration, you have a tax on the number of wheels that you put on the roads. So those of us that just have 4 wheels, we pay a tax. Those of you that have big dually trucks, you pay an extra tax. People that drive farm equipment, they pay an extra higher tax based on wear and tear on the roads. And that excise tax for that wheel tax is supposed to go back into roads. So those people that don't have cars or don't have vehicles with a lot of tonnage, they pay less. That's an excise tax. Cigarettes have a ginormous excise tax on them. And it's unbelievable, again, that people can actually even afford to smoke because those prices are outrageous. As a non-smoker, all I can just keep saying is keep raising the taxes, state of Indiana, to pay for everything you want to by the sale of cigarettes. The difference with whiskey and why this is important, because whiskey isn't just a drink. For the people on the other side of the Allegheny, whiskey is a currency. Whiskey is a way, and this is whiskey made out of corn. This is corn liquor, like that kind of thing. So if you are moving your product, it is much easier to move barrels of whiskey than it is to move grain, corn. It's lighter, whiskey is lighter, it's easier to move. So backcountry distillers most affected by a 7-cent per gallon tax, which is fairly expensive even in 2021. If we go back to 1790, 7 cents a gallon is pretty steep. Poor roads made grain transportation practical only by horseback, which hampered the potential of cash crops. So whiskey flowed freely in this region as money. And again, that's the significant part. If whiskey was just corn liquor that people drank, kind of a different story, but everyone used this as a currency. So what does that mean? You traded with this. You went to the general store and you traded, I've got 2 kegs of corn liquor, and you would get a credit at the general store. You would get $30 attached to your name. And then you would go in and buy your goods up to $30 from the general store. You would buy whatever you needed. You would buy your plow for next year. You would buy your seed corn for next year. It was currency. To tax this is a really big deal. Fast forward, we're going to have a whiskey rebellion. All right, our last thing that we have to get to so that we understand what we're looking at tomorrow is the National Bank. This is the most important Jefferson-Hamilton issue, and this is the most important part of his economic plan, because without this bank, none of this really will be able to happen. A Bank of the United States provision. Government would be major stockholder in the bank, 1/5 of the members, and this is the important part of B. The federal treasury would deposit its surplus revenues in the bank. So those surplus revenues, those tax dollars, would be deposited in the national bank, which would do a couple of things. One, it would let the government earn interest on its money. That's always positive. It would give security and sound financial stability to the money that the government makes. Where are we going to put all this money? And it would allow the government to print money based on the money that it had in the bank. And so, again, this is really important. Shouldn't be a big giant surprise to you that Thomas Jefferson hates the bank. They feared that the money interest would be at the expense of farmers. State banks would not be able to compete, and the federal government did not enjoy a monopoly of surplus. And so now we get to this last topic: strict construction, loose construction. Jefferson, strict constructionist. If it's not in the Constitution, you don't get to do it. If it does not say that it's in the Constitution, you do not get to do it. And it doesn't say anything about, I can't write. This is what you need to remember. Be fat. You do have to know all of these. So, Jefferson, strict constructionist. He says, if it's not in the Constitution, you don't get to do it. Strict constructionists usually have to fall back. Jefferson's going to have to die on this sword when he gets to become president. And he has this little thing like the Louisiana Purchase. Does the Constitution say anything about presidents buying land? Oh, no, it does not, Thomas Jefferson. You've got to eat those words. Or, as Hamilton, a loose constructionist. Hamilton urged a broad interpretation. This is the elastic clause. Hamilton says it is necessary and proper for the government to have a bank. Necessary and proper for the government to have a bank. And so as a result of that, an idea of loose construction and strict construction.